O heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, Lord ever, Lord present and fillest all things, treasure of good things and giver of life, come upon us and cleanse of all impurity and save our souls, O good one. All right, well, welcome everyone to chapter 19 and 20 of Crucifixion of the King of Glory. We're moving right along. We'll be already in Great Lent pretty quickly here, and then all of a sudden it'll be Holy Week. So amazing, we've been through 20 chapters. I guess we're a little bit over half done with the book. Yeah, so that's wonderful. So let's do as we usually do here and see if folks have anything that they particularly want to make sure that we cover before we jump into the chapters 19 and 20. Does anyone have anything that was particularly impressive to them or particularly confusing or something that they want to make sure that we go over? Please speak now or we will just jump right into it. Go ahead, Marlene. I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I have a few things. A couple things that struck me that I never thought of before. You know, we talk about crucifixion that was going on during the Roman times, and of course, our Lord was crucified. There was in one of the footnotes actually that women were also crucified. We don't really think about that, and they noted that they were scourged before the crucifixion, but women were not if they were crucified. And then they also were facing the wood when they were actually put up on the cross, which I thought was really interesting.
Me too. I'd never known that until I read that. That's a very interesting little footnote there. Mm-hmm. That supposed to be in the scourging.
That was in the first chapter.
19, yeah.
Footnote number 2.
Yeah. There it is on page 184. So for those who are interested, that I agree. That was a very interesting footnote. I did not know that.
Another thing. Oops, my husband's trying to call me. Can't do that right now. The other thing that was interesting to me, and this was, I think, already pointed out before, but again, that the group that was yelling for the Jews that were yelling for Christ to be crucified in front of Pilate were not the average Jews. They would not have done that. It was a group that they particularly gathered together just to, those that were in support of having him crucified that were there, and they didn't represent all of the Jews. I thought that was, that's very interesting too. But one of my questions that's a little confusing, and I don't know, maybe this will be explained more as time goes on. I did look into the next chapter, and it did talk about it a little bit more, is why she makes such a point of the fact that the Pilate tried to tell the Jew, the high priest, and that he saw no crime in Christ, and why he didn't feel that he wanted to crucify him, to put him to death. He didn't want to do anything to him. He wanted to just let him go. And we know all everything that led up to his crucifixion, but why then is, especially in our creed, that we blame Pilate totally? Why is Pilate the main blame for his crucifixion when I don't know, what I see almost is that it should have been the Jewish Sanhedrin and the high priests that were the main ones that hated him and wanted him crucified. So that's just, I know that may come up later, or we can address it during this conversation.
No, it's a good question. Probably we should talk about it now. Pre-pontistum. I don't know how that went from pre-pontistum to like pod-pontistum, because those are two different things. Pre-pontistum means in the reign of Pilate. Mm-hmm. It's literally in the creed. It says in the reign of Pilate, not. And so in English, and that gets translated into under Pontius Pilate.
Right.
It gives the impression that that's somehow, it's all about him. It's only supposed to be a historical marker. That just like if you remember in the beginning of the gospel, when Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem to be taxed, there were for centuries those who hated Christ and hated the gospel tried to use that against the church. To say, oh, no such thing ever happened. This is completely made up, blah, 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 blah. And of course, it turns out from archaeological evidence, 100% happened. I mean, no question about it. So those who, want to kind of mock the church usually end up glorifying it by their mockery. But yeah, the church tries to, the Gospels are full of historical evidence to show that that this really happened, like under the reign of Pontius Pilate. Okay, like was clearly a governor of Judea. That can be checked. That can be, the church knew that the Romans kept very good records, which they did. They were excellent at keeping records, especially of whom they killed and why. But in any case, and we get a lot of murders from that actually later in the next few centuries. But yeah, that's strictly under Pontius Pilate. It means under the reign of Pontius Pilate.
Okay, that makes sense.
Good. Other questions? We've got a nice group together here tonight. Anyone else have questions or comments?
I got some questions. Okay, so
go.
all right, I got well, they're not questions, they're kind of comments, but from my understanding, what Miss Marlene was saying about Pontius Pilate was totally like a wet noodle and like was kind of spineless from what I read. That's my understanding of him. Like he's not as powerful as he seems. He's not as smart as he seems. He's kind of a coward, in my opinion. That's what I learned from him. Another thing I thought was interesting was like the blanket they gave Jesus, the purple one that it took like 1,000 rare beetles to make. I thought that was interesting because it was probably like really expensive and time consuming to get all those like beetles to make the color purple, right? And I kind of equated that to like giving like a death row inmate like some lobsters to eat, like before they. So I was like, why would they give them something so nice and then sack them? So I was like, that didn't make sense. But then I'm like, it's kind of like giving somebody like one special thing before you push them off the plank. And then the third thing I thought, which I'm sure you'll touch on later, about the barbarous guy. Like in like during the time, I guess it was during Passover, and I guess there was like 4 or 5 times as many people in the city. And then I was like, why was the crowd voting for Barabbas to be saved instead of Jesus? And I was like, probably because there was such an influx of people in the city, and like they didn't have like the common knowledge of Jesus, that like the locals knew Jesus, but all these like incoming pilgrims, they didn't know about Jesus. They were in the same tribe, but like they didn't have the local knowledge. So I thought that was probably why they voted for Barabbas other than Jesus, because there's so many out of towners basically. But those 3 things I thought were really cool about the 2 chapters.
Good. Thanks, Chris, for your input. I think the same kind of, I think Marlene mentioned maybe in the beginning about how they gathered a special crowd. Like on Palm Sunday, it was the people, like everybody. Everybody was there. Everybody was welcoming Jesus Christ as the King and God. And so then surely Pilate heard about that, right? They were keeping an eye on them to make sure that there were no problems. And so he figured probably, okay, these people, and she even mentions it, these people were so in love with him like a few days ago, of course they're going to choose him. They're not going to choose Barabbas. The whole idea was to like get himself out of having to crucify Christ. So, but that group that was in front of him was not the people, the whole people. It was the morning of the great feast. People were running around getting their lambs ready and so on and so forth. And so the author makes the argument that actually the high priests kind of put together their own crowd. Like they had their own crowd there that they were already under control of from like their friends and loved ones and so on and so forth. And that's why all of these strange things happened, even strange to Pilate. He was clearly disappointed. He was surprised that they wanted Barabbas, and he was disappointed and surprised that they wanted to crucify Christ. But then Marlene sort of began to read into the next chapter, and we see that they used kind of blackmail against Pilate finally to get him to crucify Christ. So I don't want to ruin the next chapter, but I would agree. I think he's kind of a weak personality, at least in the drama that's unfolding here in front of us. He was a powerful person, but he wasn't willing to stand up for what he believed in, and that's definitely the opposite of what Christ is doing here in the chapters we're reading today. So, okay, any other thoughts, comments, questions before we kind of get started, before we jump in a little bit?
A couple times it's been mentioned that he was weak, but I kind of got the impression that he was trying to balance. I mean, he had relationships with the Jewish leadership. Perhaps he was getting kickbacks from them. There was a lot of stuff going on, and it felt to me like he was trying to have everyone be happy in the end here, or at least not too disappointed. And he's trying to thread a middle way through here, and obviously in the end was not successful in the way maybe he thought he was going to be, but and maybe maybe God had a plan in that, and
right.
But
yeah, I mean, he's a politician, and he has to fulfill his political duties, and politics is a dirty business.
I mean,
and
I think of Herod and giving his daughter anything she wanted, and she asked for the head of John the Baptist on a platter, and he was like, "Whoops,"
Right.
Once he agreed to something, then his word meant something, and off we were to the races.
Right. Exactly. Good. Okay, so let's start working through a little bit. There's a few things I want to call your attention to that I think are very interesting. At least they were interesting to me, and I hope maybe they'll be interesting to you. So I kind of liked at the beginning of the chapter where she decided, and probably it's true, that Pilate was disappointed to see Christ return from Herod. He thought that he had gotten rid of that problem, but nonetheless, Christ returned, and he had to deal with that. And then we talk about scourging, which I thought was a really informative part of the reading. At least it was for me. I was not familiar with all of the fun Roman torture techniques, and the scourging, the way she described it, it was very moving to me, and also like very informative. I never knew all of those things about the scourging, and she talks a little bit about the coercion, and how Roman citizens can't be coerced. If you remember, Paul was beaten at one point. I forget which island he was on, and when they realized that he was a Roman citizen, then the governor himself came to ask forgiveness, because that was a big deal to not have any kind of corporal punishment for Romans without a trial. But Christ was not a Roman citizen, and so Pilate thought, okay, I'll scourge him instead of crucifying him, and maybe that will satisfy the bloodlust of the people that are trying to get him killed. And then she talks about how scourging is so much more than whipping, and how much more destructive it is than just using a whip, which is strictly a piece of leather, whereas the thing that they used, flagellum, I think they called it, flagellum. It had leather, but it had these metal balls on it. It had these hooks. Like, it was very destructive to the body, both outwardly and inwardly. And if you didn't get a chance to read that, pages 184 and 185 strongly suggest that you do that, because I think it really adds a lot more to that very sort of short mention of the fact that Jesus was scourged in the Gospels, that we hear during Holy Week. We don't really focus on that very much, and that's good and fine. That's our Orthodox way. But I think knowing the sort of physical destruction of the body that took place when there was a scourging, and she noted that they must have scourged him very, very roughly, because as a young, strong man, he couldn't even carry the cross to the crucifixion. So probably, ribs were broken, and who knows what else was done. So that, at least to me, was very interesting. I think because we just kind of go right through it in Holy Week and don't pause on that, but that, at least to me, made a very big impression. So the idea of scourging for the Romans was either as a punishment or to prepare the accused person for crucifixion. And they did that so that they would die more quickly on the cross. And so I think that's interesting. They were, the Romans could be very rough, but they weren't without any kind of mercy. She then goes into this question about, was Christ beaten 39 times, or was it some other number? We don't know the answer to that. The 39, that was the limit that the Jews kept for themselves, because if they beat someone 40 times and they died, then that was considered to be murder. Whereas if they beat them 39 times and they died, it was not. So, this is kind of the straining at a gnat, right? Just these little tiny things about the law. But in any case, we don't know how much Christ was beaten. We can only ascertain that he was beaten a lot because he couldn't carry his cross. Oh, yeah. Good. Now, the mocking and the crown of thorns. So apparently, when Chris was talking about the purple robe, it is very interesting that he ended up with a purple robe. Like, that was expensive. That would have been very, very, very expensive. Nonetheless, they kept him in this purple robe. So we don't know anything more about it. But to me, that's a very interesting little data point that Chris brought up, that this is a very expensive piece of fabric. Marlene, you're on mute. You're muted.
Sorry. Matthew, though, points out where he writes it as a scarlet robe, and that's interesting too, because I kind of thought of it. Well, if he's in a purple robe, then all of his blood would have made it more scarlet, but I don't think that's what they do.
Yeah, it's, in a way, it's good. Like, the Gospels are not 10,000 page tomes with every little tiny detail. There's some things left for our kind of imagination, but it's very interesting. And we see that bishops have a mantilla that they wear into the church, either of purple or of red. Either one is acceptable. And those are the two colors that are mentioned for this robe here in the Gospels. So, but yeah, so they apparently, this kind of mocking someone who was going to be crucified was part of the punishment, because for the Romans, honor was so important. It was more important even than life. And so the punishment of crucifixion was designed to be a humiliation and to shame the victim. And the mocking was part of that. So I think that's pretty interesting. Let's see. Does she talk about the crown of thorns a lot here or not? She talks about it more later, I think. Some more details. But in any case, it's unclear what the crown of thorns was made of. It probably was not roses, something else. You get access to that crown of thorns. It still exists. It's in Paris. I forget which church it's in. Paris is a city of a lot of relics. For instance, the relics of Saint Helen, the mother of Saint Constantine the Great, are in Paris. There's a lot of relics in Paris, but officially the Roman Catholic Church doesn't really do relics anymore. And so, strictly speaking, there's very few Roman Catholic people who venerate these relics, so they kind of put them up in a way. But there's a group of Orthodox people in Paris that have this schedule. They go to different churches, Roman Catholic churches. I think it's every Friday night, maybe every Thursday. And so they go to the church where the crown of thorns is, and the priest will bring that to them. And then they do an office to Christ, and they get a chance to venerate that. Or to St. Helen, or whatever, depending on where they go. Pretty interesting little subculture that we have in Paris. That's mostly Russian and Ukrainian folks who participate in that, and Russian and Romanian folks and Ukrainian folks. But anyway, I thought that you would find that kind of interesting. Okay. Also very interesting, I think, that the scourges and the mocking and so on and so forth. This is all in Isaiah chapter 50. So if you get a chance, have a look at that, because Isaiah is a very, very interesting chapter of the Old Testament. Lots of really important prophecies there. So the Romans thought it was better to die with honor than to live with shame. And so this mocking that's happening is part, as I mentioned, of the punishment. And then she goes through and sort of has this little talk about how the fact that the Gospels contain the parts about the mocking and so on and so forth, that this shows the truth of the gospel. Why? Because the people at that time would have found this completely impossible to believe, that God could be mocked like that he would allow himself to be like that he would humble himself in such a way. We see that as virtuous, but they saw that as impossible, confusing, wrong. And so because of that, the author makes the argument that this lends more credence to the gospel narrative. Because if the gospel narrative was some kind of made-up thing which was supposed to attract people to Christianity, it would have taken into account the society in which it was written, where honor was more important, and that would have been stressed. Yet the opposite is. So I think that's a very interesting little data point. And she says something very interesting on page 188, the end of the first paragraph. Muslims reject the historical record that Jesus was crucified because they see it as humiliation and weakness, and they can't accept that. Although they accept Christ as a prophet who did so many miracles in the Quran, and whereas Muhammad did none. But anyway, Christ plays second fiddle in their eyes to Muhammad. We could talk about that for days on end. But in any case, that's, I think, a very interesting data point. Then she goes through and talks a little bit about the reed that Christ was given. This whole mocking, like they gave him the crown of thorns instead of a regular crown, right? They gave him this reed, or what she says is a rod, right? A reed for us, that seems like that's some very wimpy thing that you break out of some swamp or something. Even when it's dry, it's not going to hurt you. I mean, if you get a real whack with it, you might get a mark, but it's not something that's going to really be painful. But she says that that's really a bad translation. Really, it's a rod. It's a wooden stick which had a ball on the end of it as well. Not a big one, but a little one. In any case, she said that it wanted us to understand that it's not this little reed or a rush. It's a rod, like it's a stick. And when they beat him with that, they would have also caused damage to his body. Okay, so then we get to the robe. We talked a little bit about that, and how all of this, everything that's going on, is all a mockery of kingship, because the Romans were calling him King of the Jews, right? Which is when Pilate asked him that, he said, "Well, you say it. You said it." Right? In other words, yes, that is true. And so they were mocking him for that. And she points out that even Jesus's crucifixion, being put up on Golgotha, was sort of a mockery of a king surrounded by his counselors, whereas on his throne, whereas Christ was here on the cross surrounded by thieves. So, and then I think this is no, it's not. She wrote this, and I thought it was very interesting. Just as Pilate and Caiaphas spoke the truth about who Jesus was, even though they did not believe it, the soldiers' actions expressed the truth of who Christ was, also the King of Heaven, even though they did not recognize him. In the parody, the truth was revealed. That statement, in the parody, the truth was revealed, is, I think, an important thing for us to keep in mind as we observe and participate in the entire sort of crucifixion narrative. All right, so then there's a conversation about the crown of thorns, what it was, so on and so forth, how much pain it would have been causing Christ. As someone who suffers from migraines, when I read that, it seemed to me that it is something like that. Not to minimize what Christ was experiencing, but a really good migraine can be so painful that you just don't even want to move your head. And that's sort of what it sounded like to me, but that's my context in which I can understand that. So she says, many thorns would have penetrated Jesus' scalp, resulting in significant pain, exacerbated by his being struck on the head with the reed or the rod while he was wearing the crown of thorns. Okay, and so we sort of end the chapter with Pilate one more time trying to get out of having to crucify Christ. And he thought, well, okay, I'll show him now. I'll show him to the people. He's been beaten. He's been scourged. He's bleeding all over the place. Hopefully this will be it, and they'll leave me alone, and I can get back to getting ready for the Passover. So if there's an insurrection, I'll be ready to fight back. But interestingly, that was the opposite of what happened. So he showed Christ to them, and they said, take him away, crucify him, crucify him. Again, remember, this is not the same proud makeup that was welcoming Christ on Palm Sunday, right? This was a special crowd which was chosen by the high priest and chief priests, who were the ones who were driving this whole process, right? So they say, take him away, crucify him, and then Pilate's like, well, do it yourself, because I don't want to do it. I have no reason to do it. And strictly speaking, it was probably illegal for Pilate to do it. But that's not how it turned out. She says, the Jewish leaders were relentless. Then Pilate thought of another way to release Jesus and extricate himself from this problem by offering clemency. It was Passover, and 2 prisoners were in Roman custody, Jesus and Barabbas. Okay, so Barabbas is an interesting name. It literally means son of the Father. In the parody, the truth is revealed, right? So the true son of the Father is not released, but the one whose name means son of the Father, Bar, it's son, Abba, it's father. And he's the one who ends up getting released. So Pilate is looking for ways to avoid embarrassing the Sanhedrin, but he also doesn't want to crucify Christ because he hasn't violated any Roman laws at all. So he thought, okay, they like to release, so they want me to release somebody. The Romans didn't have this practice. This was a Jewish practice that was from before the Roman times, quite far before. They would release people at certain times for certain reasons. Like there are certain cycles of years. On a Jubilee year, I believe everyone's debts were forgiven. And so there were all these different things in the Mosaic law. And one of these was releasing a prisoner on the eve of Passover. And so Pilate had been around long enough in Judea that he knew that they had this practice and they would want him to do that. So he thought, okay, I'm going to wiggle myself out of this for sure. They're definitely gonna ask for Jesus, because just a few days ago they were calling him King and God, singing Hosanna to the highest, so on and so forth. So like they couldn't have changed their minds that much. But of course, that's not the way that it worked out. So she points out on page 194 that the Pilate thought, okay, he'll save face for the Sanhedrin because they can blame the Romans for releasing Jesus, right? It wasn't them, it was the Romans. But the Sanhedrin was not interested in Jesus's freedom being blamed on the Romans. They wanted his death to be blamed on the Romans. They wanted him to be hung on a tree. That was very important for them, to show that from their point of view, he was cursed. Okay, now Barabbas he's often called a robber in English, but she goes through sort of Greek etymological process here to show us that really we're talking more about like a bandit, like a highway bandit, or maybe even a guerrilla, like a revolutionary. So interesting that the Romans hadn't killed him already. Maybe he was just like a minor player in the thing. It's hard to know, because it also says that he's notorious. So he was a well-known person to the Jews. In any case, he was not a guy, who was stealing ladies' purses. This was a guy who was fighting revolution or something like that. and would have probably killed Roman soldiers. So surely they had no intention nor desire to release him. So, yeah, she writes that Pilate had not suggested Barabbas, which he didn't, would not have wanted to release him, and never anticipated that Barabbas would be chosen over Jesus. St. John Chrysostom remarks on this bizarre, convoluted order of events and the reversal of roles among the parties. Usually, the people ask for a prisoner to be released, and the judge decides whether to release him. But here, the judge is suggesting the release and asking the people to decide which prisoner to let go. So that is a very interesting kind of irony, that everything is kind of backwards. And, well, in the backwardsness, they ended up asking for Barabbas. So then she goes through and I think does a really good job talking about the crowd. What was that crowd? Who were those people that were there calling for Christ to be crucified, calling for the freedom of Barabbas? Those were all people who were very local to the Praetorium, which was right beside the temple, right? Who had brought Christ to Pilate to try to get him killed? It was the priests. It was the chief priest, the high priest. They brought him there. And that's where they all mostly lived, and they had control of that place. They were the ones who ruled on the Temple Mount. And so it was very easy for them to get a crowd, quote unquote, of people who were very, very sympathetic to their position. And so this is the crowd that is there. Now, there's no way that Pilate, however good a politician he was, would have been able to discern whether that crowd was already stacked against Jesus. Just impossible. He would have thought, okay, it's like these average people. But of course, the average people were running around getting ready for the feast. It's like on Holy Saturday. What kind of crowd are you going to get of Orthodox Christians on Holy Saturday, right? Only one that you've contracted with ahead of time. Everybody else is either trying to take a rest or getting everything ready for Pascha. Same thing here. It's not like people were just lollygagging around the Praetorium or the temple. They were busy. They were busy getting ready for the feast. So I think it's a really interesting little piece, and if you didn't get a chance to read that, would strongly recommend that you do that. And as long as Pilate was sort of stalling in trying to save Jesus, the priests were able to bring more and more people into this crowd. So that's a very interesting piece, I think. Yeah, let's see if there's anything else here that I wanted to talk about. No, I think that's it. Those are the things that made the most impression on me in those two chapters. And some of you shared some of your thoughts about the things that made the most impression on you. Now, maybe that we've had a chance to talk about that, there are additional questions, or maybe you thought of something else as I was sort of droning on about the things that I found that I thought were interesting. So I wonder if anyone has anything that they would like to contribute to the group discussion now. Use the raise your hand thing on the bottom of your screen. There's a little hand. If you press it, it shows me that you would like to say something. I'm not saying you have to do that. You can do that, or you can just unmute yourself and ask a question. Okay, so the next chapter is the sentencing. So this is, I think, this is not going to be long. Let's see, how many pages is this one? That's a few. Okay, like 6 or 7 pages, not long. And then I'll talk there about how Pilate managed to get himself into the situation where he could be essentially blackmailed by the Jewish leaders. So I think that'll be very interesting. Okay. So 2 chapters tonight, and thank you everyone for being for understanding. Last week I was sick. I got a special blessing, I guess, when I went to Chicago. Everybody that went for Father Vladimir's, I think our nation got sick, and everybody who went to Trump's inauguration. Not quite sure why it was those two places, but whoever went to either one of those got sick. And yeah, so, but we're recovering. Yes, Marlene.
Um, I wasn't, I wasn't participating in the meeting last week, but I did watch the video, and I do want to say that I don't think you need to do the study guides. I know that's a lot of work for you, and I'm fine with you not doing it. Just want to put my 2 cents in there.
Thank you. You know, the study guide is really helpful for me too. Like it helps me to put my thoughts together. But honestly, I haven't been able to do it now for a few weeks. So thank you for saying that. Hopefully, I'll be able to do it again. But yeah, ever since Politica died, things have been pretty intense. And you know, thank God, so far I've gotten out of bed every morning. That's good, but there hasn't been a lot of extra time, and I just haven't quite been able to get that done. So thank you for saying that, and hopefully I'll get to do it again. But if not, then thank you. Good. Anything else that folks would like to talk about? Questions they'd like to ask? Comments they'd like to make? Okay. So I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Next week we'll do chapter 21. It's called The Sentencing. And then we'll move into the third part of the book, which is the last part of the book, as we prepare ourselves for Holy Week. So this Sunday is Zacchaeus, which is a word that often strikes fear into the hearts of Orthodox Christians, because it means the week after that, the Lenten Triodian begins. Actually, I'm joking. My point was that I made in the sermon on Sunday is that we should be thankful that we get to Great Lent coming so quickly again, and that it's good for us. But yeah, like we'll read the Gospel of Zacchaeus this Sunday, and then the Sunday after that we'll begin the Lenten Triodian, Rivers of Babylon, and the whole thing. So I think it's great, and I know people probably think I'm weird, but to me, the best part of Great Lent is that you just like to you can just release all pretensions and just be a Christian, like just not worry about other stuff, focus on the services, and you get so much out of it. So at least that's been my experience.
Unless you're like me, then it's like, oh no, I have to do all this preparation. It's a lot of work, but it's good. It's good.
That is true. That is true. It's a lot of work, but you know, the services are so beautiful and meaningful. Like
sure.
sometimes I lead on Wednesday afternoons for the Wednesday evening pre-sanctified, and it is a lot of work to put it together. But you know, like those words that are there are so nice, and the hymns are so nice. Like to me, I would argue. Now sorry for those of you who aren't choir geeks, we're gonna get into this a little bit. I would argue that the most beautiful music in the entire Orthodox hymnography is for the pre-sanctified liturgy. Like there's so many different things that are written for it, and it's just amazing music. So I mean, everyone has their taste. I get it, but for me, it's just incredible. Like some of the trios are just so wonderful. So anyway, looking forward to it. Just like 5 or 6 weeks. It's all good. All right. Thank you, everyone. I won't go on about that. We've got plenty of time to think about Great Lent. And let's now say a prayer, and we will say good night. It is truly meet to bless thee, the Theotokos, ever blessed and most blameless and mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God, the Word, the very Theotokos, thee do we magnify. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. I look forward to seeing you.
Thank you.
Next week, I'm going to be in a train when we're supposed to meet, and I bet it's not going to work. So we might have to juggle a little bit. So I'll send everybody an email, and we'll see what works for everybody.
Okay.
Okay. Good night.